I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua, and as an expat, a lot of you are likely going to be facing a lot of challenges in moving money around, probably for the first time in your life. Not that you've never moved money around, but the challenges that you're likely to face in moving between countries is often stuff that catches people by surprise. And if you're a tourist and you're just on vacation, you're hitting the ATM and pulling out a few $100s, maybe even a few $1,000s over a short period of time in order to fund your hotels and spas and hikes up the mountain and tours and all those kinds of things, you're probably not running into any problems. We're used to this, and there's a certain amount of money that's just expected to be available to people for normal everyday life and those tourist activities, and those things are meant to be fluid, and they're designed to make it easy for you. Everybody pretty much wants you to be able to travel and do touristy kind of things, so they enable that pretty much. But once you move to a country and you're starting to do bigger things like paying rent, not a hotel night, but really paying rent, and you're not just buying a meal, but you're buying groceries, and not just buying souvenirs, but buying appliances, maybe cars, possibly houses. We're talking about a different order of magnitude of the amount of money and the frequency of money that needs to move around. And so we often, as we become new expats, full-time expats, we are often faced, not always, some people manage to stay in that tourist mode and never spend those big amounts of money in big chunks. But for a lot of us, almost all of us, you're going to be facing moving a lot of money around in ways you've never had to do before, and there's going to be some surprises. And I want to talk about some of those mechanisms today to give you an idea of how and why some of those things are challenging. And while I don't have great solutions, that's the sad part. I'm just going to warn you right up front before someone complains that I don't have this just do this thing and it's magic. I'm not here to sell you a scam. I'm here to try to tell you how it works so that you have the knowledge to go out and try to solve your individual banking and international money movement problems. And we're going to talk about that right after the bump. Before we get started, we're going to talk about a concept called KYC. This is what we talk about a lot in financial circles, and everyone else has no idea what we're talking about. KYC is know your customers. I know the first thing that goes through your mind is cover your something, but that's CYA, right? This is know your customer. And what that is a specific requirement used by money laundering monitoring agencies to be aware of where money is coming from. That's the customer. So the customer is, in this case, a bank or government's customer. You have to know where their money is coming from, and you have to know where it is going to. So if I'm sending money from myself in country A and I'm sending it to a friend in country B, I have to prove who I am in the first country and where my money has come from. And this is, a lot of people are like, well, I don't like that. I don't like it either, but this is international law. Nearly all countries are part of the international money laundering framework for trying to prevent international money laundering, right? Everybody has internal controls for that, but there's an external, and that's why you see the same amounts of money repeated over and over again as limits for things and challenges, and when it gets difficult and expensive or whatever, it's because they're all sharing these same rules. It's a single framework that nearly everyone has agreed to. So I have to prove not just that it's my money, but where it came from. Oh, I sold a house, it's from my salary, and investments, whatever. And then the person who's receiving it has to show, they don't have to show where they're going to spend it in most cases, but they do have to show who they are and why they're receiving money. Just why might be because they know me, right? Doesn't have to be a big thing, but you have to have some amount of knowing who everybody is. So when you're sending money internationally, you've always got to have that passport or some kind of national ID, sometimes more paperwork than that, but generally that's going to be enough, or some additional just to make sure it's really you kind of thing, but your passport to identify you is generally enough. But those things are going to be required, and you're not going to find workarounds to that, right? You're not going to be able to just go and very casually be like, oh, I'm going to not do a know your customer. I'm going to not have to go through these mechanisms. There's got to be, people work around this all the time, right? No, they absolutely do not, right? A few people do. They're known as money launderers, right? That's what working around that entails. That's what it implies. So that's not something you want to be doing, and you want to avoid that. So don't even seek that out. That shouldn't be your goal. Now, being able to move money easily, yes, that should be a goal. So in any transaction like this, an international transfer, there's three main components that you just need to picture in your mind. There is funding the transaction. That is somehow coming up with the money that goes into the transaction. And basically all transactions are done by banks. That's who moves money between countries. And I'm not going to go into all the details of how banks do that. That would be boring even for me. But It's essentially no one else has the capability of doing this, right? Individual people are not allowed to move large amounts of money between countries. You are allowed to carry a small amount in cash, and you will notice that the amount you're allowed to carry in cash or other assets on your person, right? Could be gold, it could be silver. Some of those things are additionally restricted, but the total value of all the things you have is limited to $10,000. And not coincidentally, the total amount you're allowed to do through electronic transfer means without hitting international requirements for KYC is $10,000. Why? Because it's the same rule being applied in two different situations that seem different, but are actually exactly the same thing. In both cases, cash of one sort or another is being carried over a border, and up to $10,000 internationally is generally seen as a normal movement of money. And while they still need to know who you are, they don't generally need to know where your money came from, and they especially don't need to know how you plan on spending it. But once you get above that number, you need to really prove who you are and be able to show that you have some reasonable reason to have that money. I suddenly had it fall into my lap is not a good reason, right? That looks an awful lot like you just robbed a bank. So those aren't things you want to be doing, right? And it's unfortunate that if you did discover a hoard of cash in a hole in the ground, that you can't just pop it into Western Union and send it to another country. That'd be pretty fantastic for a lot of reasons, but it would also be problematic because we don't know you found it in a hole in the ground. You may have found it somewhere else that you weren't supposed to be. So it doesn't work that way, right? They have to have those protections in place, or, you know, people finding money randomly is one in a million. The people who are trying to do something a little bit nefarious with the money is pretty common. So that's why those rules are there. We all hate them, but they're necessary. So we have this funding source. That's the first thing, where your money's coming from, and you have to give it to a bank. We don't care where, well, KYC cares. Outside of that, from a transaction perspective, we don't really care where it comes from. It has to be handed to a bank that's going to be doing the transfer. Governments don't really move, governments do move money between themselves directly, sometimes, normally through their own banks, though, not through the governments themselves. But it's not individuals doing it once you hit that 10,000 number. You really can't realistically do that. You would be in the position of walking over a border with tons and tons of cash. First of all, very dangerous. Secondly, then going to the border and saying, okay, I'm above the $10,000 limit. I need to declare this and go through the KYC and all the import duties that are required of me, right? Because that's essentially what you're doing. It's a little bit different, but it's still an import of money. That's the banks have a deal with the government to import money on a regular basis, or export, right? So they are licensed to do that, and they have an overhead to do that, and they do it electronically, and it's very, very cheap, and it's heavily monitored, like heavily, like you wouldn't believe, monitored in all cases, and not just by the government that you're at, often others, definitely the United States. No matter where you are in the world, if you think the US isn't monitoring your financial transactions, you're delusional, right? They most definitely are. They may not care, but they're definitely keeping them on record, right? Everywhere in the world. It's just how things work. So, and so before someone jumps in and says, that's why we don't use the US dollar, how does the paper US dollar connect to that? How someone got that thought, I have no idea. The US has a strong arm of financial institutions around the world, and they control the SWIFT system. So everybody has to report to the United States, so the US can cut them off from the financial institutions. The fact that they're using US dollars is irrelevant. Watch out for people pulling that stunt. This is one of those places where there's a hook for people to try to create a false panic and try to scam you. So just something to be alerted by, right? The US dollar has a lot of reasons that we'd like to not use it for a lot of things. Those are unrelated. It doesn't have microchips in it to monitor you and where it goes. They have no idea. The currency is actually very hard to track. Okay, so once you've funded the institution that's doing the transfer, a transfer has to take place. That's where the institution, hopefully you have the same institution on both sides, and they just move it internally, going through some very stringent international control mechanisms and reporting in the middle, but the money itself just moves between one institution. But that's the rarity. Typically it's moving between an institution in one country and an institution in the other, doing an agreement and all these things in between. Then that institution in the new country has to pay out the person who's going to be receiving it, right? So those are the three pieces: the funding, the transfer, and the payout. And those are the parts we have to manage. Now, if you're moving money we're just going to use the US and Nicaragua as an example because I talk about it a bit. I live in Nicaragua and I do send my money from the United States. So this is perfect, right? Again, if you're doing a small amount of money, just go to the ATM and take it out. No problem. Nothing at all. Very, very simple. One of the reasons that they encourage this is because ATM transactions are extremely visible, right? They know exactly what your funding source is. It's your own bank in your own country that knows everything about how the money got to it. They have all that on record already. and they know exactly where you are because your passport went from one country to another, so they know your transit, and they know you're at the ATM proving your identity with a card at the ATM, taking your picture, contacting your bank, having a conversation, pulling your money out, putting it in your hands at a limit that's far below the KYC, international money laundering monitoring limits. And they know exactly when and where it happened. They know so much about that transaction, they're perfectly happy to let you do that, right? So ATMs make governments happy. So ATMs are the frictionless system, right? That's why that's so easy. But let's say you're going to move more money than that. You want to buy a car, you want to buy a house. And someone mentioned, recently I was challenged in trying to fund a car purchase. And so we're going to see why. Okay. So so whatever institution you're going to work with in the United States, in this example, you're going to send to Nicaragua as an expat. You have money there. In this case, my money was already there. I didn't have to do a bunch of proving where it came from, right? It's my normal transactions with my bank and not doing something weird. I'm just buying a car, right? So they're like, okay, yeah, he's got his money here. I did have to pull it from one bank into another because of, we'll see in a second, just moving things around, right? So there's a little bit of that, but it's very simple. All the U.S. institutions see each other. So it's just money moving between banks of my own accounts. 100% visibility, nobody really cares. So the KYC is basically covered right there. You've got a salary going into a bank, it accumulates, it gets moved. Easy peasy. So wanting to send the money to Nicaragua turned into a problem because my bank, which is a small bank, uses a larger bank in order to do its clearing. That is the transaction internationally. That bank doesn't like Nicaragua and refused to do business with them. Period. It's not a legal requirement, although they claimed that at first, which led a lot of people to think that this was a much harder thing than it was. But remember, it's a common thing in U.S. businesses to lie. It's a very dishonest business environment because dishonesty is relatively protected in the United States. So it is a common tactic, both socially and legally, to simply lie about things to get out of requirements. It's up to you to prove that they're lying. And if they don't expose their internal processes, there's not much you can do. So at first, this bank was simply lying and saying, oh, no, the government won't let us send. And eventually when we said, well, but we send all the time from other banks, they're like, oh, okay, we made that up. Actually, we just didn't want to send it. So we're like, okay, well, that's awful, but our other bank is good. So we just move the money over to our other bank, and our other bank's like, yeah, of course we're going to send it to Nicaragua. What are you talking about? So we funded the bank in the United States. Now I could do this with any source of income that I wanted, right? As long as the KYC is covered. So I could send US dollars, I could send Canadian dollars, I could send euros, I could send won or yen or Bitcoin or Monero, whatever. Any of those things are fine. Now, my bank in the United States won't necessarily take all of those. I don't think they have a way to process yen or won. Actually, they probably do, but they probably can process any of them, but they're not going to do it simply for a transaction. It's just way too cumbersome. So the expectation is I would take whatever foreign currency or alternative currency that I may have access to and just convert it to US dollars for making the transaction. Because I want to take out US dollars on this side because it was a car. Sometimes that does make sense. So funding with U.S. currency is the easiest thing. U.S. to U.S., you don't have to worry about any transitions along the way. But you could do a transition along the way. That is an option, of course. So really, a transaction like this can be funded from any mechanism that you want. Often people are convinced that you're not able to use certain things. I can't use my Japanese yen for this. They don't let me. Or I can't use Bitcoin for this. They won't let me. Well, it's not quite true. It's just that they're not doing the convenience in most cases of doing the transition into U.S. dollars for you, because the banking transition into Nicaragua in most countries has to happen in certain acceptable currencies or certain currencies that have enough liquidity between the two countries. The countries themselves may not have any regulations or very few regulations as to which currencies can move between them by banking systems. That's actually relatively uncommon. There are exceptions. Belize, for example, does not allow the open transfer of currencies. So you have to work in very specific currencies under very specific regulations. But other countries, generally, you can move whatever you want around without a real problem, but you still need enough liquidity to be able to do so. So some things like Bitcoin, even Bitcoin as popular as it is problematic for a company trying to move it into Nicaragua because there isn't a Bitcoin bank in Nicaragua capable of handling the transfer, right? Because they don't actually move the money between them. They're actually transferring balance sheets. And so if I was to say, put, this would be a lot, right? 1 Bitcoin into the United States in order to buy a car. That'd be a pretty sweet car. The bank in Nicaragua isn't actually going to receive that Bitcoin from the United States. They're not allowed to do that. As much as it feels like that would be the logical thing, that's not an option. What they have to do is actually have a Bitcoin that they're going to transfer into my name in their system, right? And then when I go to get my money, they cash it out into U.S. currency so that I can buy the car, right? So in order to do that transfer, there has to be enough Bitcoin in both the U.S. bank and the foreign bank to be able to handle the transaction. Well, there's only U.S. dollars that can regularly do this, and Cordoba to a lesser degree. If you have a really large U.S. bank, they may have enough Cordoba to be able to do these transfers as well. So you have to work in the currencies that are liquid between the countries. Again, not about regulations, not about rules in most cases. It's about the functionality of the banking systems. And this is why the U.S. dollar is so powerful and why the euro is so powerful. You need these massive economies with a standardized currency available broadly across many regions to be able to do these things. So we see things like the Brazilian real is able to do this to a lesser degree. The Chinese yuan is able to do this because they're giant economies and there are enough of their currencies floating around in big economies that they can do these transfers. But when you start coming to Nicaragua, for example, as much as we would love to accept Brazilian reales, we can't. We don't have any of them to use as liquidity. So that's an important part to understand. So you can fund already with any bank from any source. They don't care what it is. It's just that they're not, under normal conditions, going to give you that extra convenience of transferring it into the necessary transfer currency. Started to get Spanish stuck in my head. For you, they're going to make you do it. Now, a few places that are larger or more capable or just focused on customer service or trying to promote certain services may do some of that for you. Wow, we're on the Canadian border. We're all about taking Canadian money. We're going to give you US and where you're headed to. Wow, that's fantastic. Super easy. Okay, great. Or some places will advertise. We're doing Bitcoin or Monero or whatever now because we want to attract that audience, and we're going to make it one step simpler. You can give us Bitcoin, and we're going to send your US dollars on. We'll do the transfer. We'll handle everything for you, right? Absolutely great. The reason you don't really like that is that you don't have any control or no strong control over your transfer rates, right? You're going to get a conversion that's probably less favorable than you could get if you did it yourself and oversaw each of the pieces individually. But from a convenience factor, could be really excellent. So your mileage may vary, but that is why it's not super popular and people don't really look for it, and why banks don't really offer it. Doesn't really make that much sense. If you are working in an alternative currency, whether a fiat from another country or an alternative currency in the traditional sense, it's probably something you can easily do the transfers as well or better than the bank can for you. So it's a rare circumstance where someone would actually want the bank to handle that, as it's purely happening in the US. That's important, right? So that's the funding piece. Now the transfer, that's always or nearly always going to happen in US dollars because there just isn't any other way to do it because of that liquidity. And that's where we measure the $10,000 limit. They don't care how much you fund. They only care about how much transfers. You're welcome to give your bank $100 million as long as they're only transferring 10,000 in the transfer. That's what's going to catch you. Once it's hitting that 10,000 number, all kinds of reporting and flags happen to the international banking system. Everybody monitors the transaction. They make sure they're tracking who sent it, where it's going, and all that stuff, right? They always track that, but then they really track it, like with extra details, and they put it into a different system where it's really, really visible and they're paying attention to it. Normally, it's just caught by some AI that's scanning to look for anomalies, right? But this stuff is really being watched because it's potentially a lot of money, and people aren't moving $10,001. They're typically moving $9,999 all the time to keep from setting off the flags, or transferring $50,000 because once you're bothering to go over the limit, you might as well go for it, right? Grab the gusto. So you're transferring your money into the other country. It's transferring in US dollars. This is where people get stuck. They want to work around this limitation. Why do I have to do all this paperwork? I want to send more than 10,000, not 100,000, but more than 10,000, maybe 15,000. This is really annoying. I don't want to have US dollars moving around. I don't want to start with that. I don't want to end with that. Well, there isn't going to be an easy workaround to this, right? Everybody thinks that they can find some simple niche in this armor, but there isn't, because the money has to transfer between the countries, and there's only a few authorized paths to do that, other than, of course, smuggling and other criminal activities are notwithstanding. We know that obviously you could just fly things in over the border through smuggling planes and drop barrels of gold into the jungle if you want to do that. Obviously that can happen. That's illegal. We're talking about legal means, right? So those legal means are either you're crossing the border yourself or you are using the banking systems. That's it. Those are your options. Now you may point out, like, well, what about Western Union, MoneyGram? those are technically banks. So when we say banking mechanisms, that's what we mean much of the time. Also, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, and big banks like that, BAC, who have big international transfer agreements, they do this all the time. So in many cases, when people are talking about trying to solve problems with money transfers between countries, they focus on funding or receiving the money, but those are the simple parts. It is the transfer that is complicated, and you'll see a lot of people advertise that they think, well, I'm going to use cryptocurrency or something that has an alternative transfer mechanism in order to use money in Nicaragua or anywhere in the world. And what they're missing is that if they're looking at a country, let's say Argentina, that is has a very large banking system, they have local mechanisms that work in those currencies. Not any currency, but Bitcoin, Monero, and some of the major ones, right? USDT. You're going to find that you have access to these on the market. They have they're tradable currencies on the market with liquidity, not just one or two people who have it. You actually have liquidity. Because of that, and because they don't have limitations on what types of currencies you can move, you're able to look at it as, well, I'm going to use those currencies to do a movement, and potentially you can. But not always. But when you do, if it's legal, it's going to go through a banking mechanism, which could be as simple as an ATM. They're going to track that transfer. They're actually going to track it as a transfer from your source country to your new country and track it to you. It's going to be very, very KYC enabled, right? When you're talking about a place like Nicaragua that does not have that liquidity, you could always, right, find a person who has access to one of those currencies and be willing to take it out for you. But they're probably taking on a risk, and often it may be illegal, right? Now, it may not be, but you're talking about finding individual people who are going to do it with you can't just move, well, I got 100 million, I can move that. No, you can only move what they're able to cash out for you personally, right? So that's very important to understand that it's a different type of mechanism, even when it's legal. If you're talking about doing a transfer directly, some people will say, well, I can just I have, right, Bitcoin in the U.S. We always use Bitcoin as the example, and I'm just going to use it in Nicaragua. Well, that's the challenge, right? You can't use it in Nicaragua. No one's going to accept it. I mean, there are places that will accept it. You'll never find one, right? Now, would I accept it? Sure, I'd be willing to accept it. I can easily cash it out in the United States, but it's important to understand, I have to cash it out in the United States. I can't cash it out here. So I'm not, if you're paying me from the U.S., you have Bitcoin in the U.S. and you're paying me for something here, you're paying me in the U.S. You're not paying me here. That's what's happening behind the scenes. So when someone says, oh, I was able to do, a Bitcoin transaction or something, you need to figure out, did it actually transfer jurisdictions? Because let's say you give me $100 worth of Bitcoin, right? You're going to, I don't know, buy my used camera from me, and you're like, look, I don't have cash here, but I'll give you some Bitcoin in your wallet in the US. Okay, fine. Yeah, no problem. That works, right? I need to sell the camera. I don't really want to sell a camera, but let's say we did. And so I give you that camera, you give me that $100 worth of Bitcoin, and I say, okay, now I want to use it. Well, if I want to use it in the U.S., maybe I can keep using it as Bitcoin. I don't have to cash it out. Maybe someone will just take it. That's a possibility. But more likely, I'm going to cash it out to U.S. dollars, and then I may bring it to Nicaragua, or I may not. That's up to me. But if I cash it out, it's with a bank in the U.S., and I get that $100 in the U.S., and now I'm back to U.S. dollars again. If I want to bring that $100 to Nicaragua and actually spend it in Nicaragua, it has to go through that money, that international transfer. Now, for $100, it'll just come through the ATM. Nice and easy. So you can, in some theoretical sense, say, oh, look, you can spend Bitcoin in Nicaragua. Sure, if you have a bank in the U.S. and transfer it to U.S. dollars. But if I just gave you $100, or you just gave me $100 to start with, I have the exact same mechanism, just one step fewer, right? In that example, trading into and out of Bitcoin is completely a red herring. It doesn't actually part of the process. It happens outside of the process. The actual transfer always happens in U.S. dollars. And so it's easy to be under the impression that places are doing this transfer by actually just sending money around, but that's really not happening, right? There's an international transfer happening at the moment that you withdraw, if you ever do. Now, if you never have to withdraw, and this is where some people are able to, in some economies, have this kind of mobile financing going on, right? If I had Bitcoin and everybody wanted to work with Bitcoin here, we could all work in Bitcoin and never take the money in or out. And then it would seem like we had an alternative currency that was bypassing the system. And in a way, maybe we are. But if we ever want to turn it back into some kind of fiat currency, we won't be able to do it here. We have to go back to the US, and everybody in the system has to cash out in the US. And so we're right back to where we started, just with much bigger numbers, with a lot of activity in the meantime. But the problem is, until you can cash it out locally, no one ever wants to do transactions in it. And even if you can, like you could in El Salvador, they proved that nobody actually wanted to do the transactions like that anyway, even with the massive move-in of people who were super interested in alternative currencies and it becoming a huge focus of the country with the most momentum of any country in the world. It was an abject failure. It was not a good mechanism. Now, other things may be a better mechanism. They picked a really bad way to handle it. But it was early. They were early adopters. They were trying some things out. Kudos for them for being willing to try some things. And hey, sometimes you got to throw things against the wall and see what sticks. And it's sad that they made some probably pretty foreseeable mistakes there. Had they tried, for example, Monero, maybe it would have worked, right? There are systems that have a lot lower overhead and a little bit more flexibility, but they had to start somewhere, right? And so they did. And it was an interesting experiment, but they showed that even with the government pushing hard and investing and losing tons of money on the process, they still couldn't get adoption to take place. It's just way more cumbersome. And so the same thing you're going to find with international transfers, trying to do things outside the system. It is the complete lack of any institution that is willing to accept large-scale money for that that makes that not practical. All it takes is one large institution who's willing to communicate with the government, display all the transfer records, do the know your customer stuff, act like a normal bank to make that possible. But there's no financial incentive for anyone to do that because there's no greater need. There's no big push for crypto inside the country. There isn't any solution to be solved, because even in countries where you can do this, it doesn't actually, under normal circumstances, provide some significant benefit over the existing very simple systems. So very rarely do people want to do this. If you have systems where all these things are in place, some people just want to do this and are willing to go through the extra effort because they love the mechanism, or that's the form that their money is already in. So it may make sense for them, and that's absolutely fine, right? Nothing wrong with that. But if you don't have it, if you don't have any pressure for it, you don't have investment groups that are using it, you don't have people who are, artificially inflating it, you don't have a government that's pushing for it, there's not actually any financial incentive, because we don't actually have any mechanism that is a problem. The issue is, as is universal, not all banks want to send to all countries, and they have to have special agreements and banks in the other country that they're going to work with and so forth. And so you're always going to have some amount of limitation and overhead and effort when moving money between countries. And if you want to do so in US dollars or in Brazilian reales or in Canadian dollars or euros or pounds sterling or BTC or Monero, all of them have the same limitations. You have to have liquidity on both sides. You have to have people who are willing to take the transfer. You have to have people who are willing to cash it out. You have to have customers that are willing to accept it. You have to have some amount of mechanism, and that's, if it solves it one place, it solves it every place. It doesn't solve it every place. We have existing mechanisms that are equally usable as it is, and so yeah, we may see greater adoption in the future simply because it's a new technology or a new mechanism that's available and that may be seen as more handy. It would be great if more banks started using it, but that would be an under the hood thing. We wouldn't even be aware of it if that was the case. I would still take USD to my bank in the US. They would convert it to something that worked really well, send that, they would convert it back, and then I get Cordoba, right? I wouldn't even be working in that currency myself in most cases. So it's an under the hood mechanism in that case. And that's something that people also don't understand, that under the hood transfer mechanism system doesn't actually affect you directly, and not something you need to be aware of, right? It may be a point of interest, but it's not a significant factor in anything that you're doing. So when looking at this stuff, these problems are not very big. It is basic problems of international money transfer. It has nothing to do with specific currencies. There's no way to use crypto to solve a problem that doesn't really exist and remains about the same regardless of what you're using. But by thinking about what actually is going on, well, should answer pretty much everything that you're wondering. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee using any of these mechanisms that you would like at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Alan Miller. It comes directly to me. It's like Patreon, and helps support the channel and all the work that we do here. As always, get in those comments, say hello, ask your own questions, get in the show notes for any information that you need, and I will see all of you tomorrow.